Fried Asian. I am Keith Chow. I am joined by an amazing dude. He is the co-host of the podcast Modern Minorities on the Potluck Podcast Network. He's also the co-host of the Quarantine Comics Podcast, and he's a super dope fellow. Please welcome to Southern Fried Asian, my man Raman Sehgal.
Nice to meet you, Keith. Finally, I feel like stars
It's
have
been
aligned.
a long time coming.
Yeah,
long time coming.
I think that might have been the first time I've been unironically called dope. So, like,
You're a
you
dope
just made my
dude.
day.
Dope dude. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, man.
And let me just preface, the reason you're on the Southern Fried Asian podcast is something that I learned recently after talking to some mutuals, is that, and I don't know why I learned this, you say this on the podcast, you're from Alabama.
Born and raised.
You're the perfect person for this podcast.
And it's usually my fun fact, like when you do an icebreaker at like a corporate business meeting or something, or you go on a podcast, like, what's something about you no one knows? Although now it's, my mom and dad live in the great state of Alabama.
So let's just get that out of the way.
Yeah.
Like, how did your family end up in Alabama?
Yeah, I have to go a little further. I don't and I do, but it's always fun to do it. So my parents are Indian American, but they're not like a lot of other Indian Americans in this country. So my dad was born in what is now Pakistan before partition. So that is like a lot of North Indians. Mm-hmm. Moved to Delhi as a little boy. After his father passed away, he left in his late teens. So he came over to Canada first as an architect. And then, school in the United States, worked as an architect in Detroit, but got a professorship at Tuskegee University, a historically black college in Alabama. Around the same time he was getting this job offer, he was writing his family back in India saying, hey, I think I'm ready to get married. I want to start meeting some people. So on the other side of the world in England, my mom was actually born in Uganda, Africa, and they fled to England as refugees because of Idi Amin. Literally lived in England without their parents for a few years, her and her siblings.
Wow.
So by this point, I think her parents had just come up from Africa. They're writing back to India. We think our daughter is ready to start meeting people. So it was a quasi-arranged marriage. My parents don't like to talk about all the other people that they met. but I think they went on some dates in England or India. My sister and I are still getting the story straight out of them from that era. But they moved to Alabama because Dad had this job. And he also had a co-practice as an architect in Montgomery, the capital. And my dad's dream was to design a house. He's a modern architect, urban designer. So he built a house that looks like a triangle. And that's where they, they just started their life there. And, we weren't, there were only like 10, 15 Indian families at the time. Now there's hundreds. But they were kind of founders of this, Indian American community, because a lot of the Indians in Alabama, there are pockets of them in all the little small towns, but they weren't in Montgomery. They were in Birmingham and Huntsville because there's a lot
bigger cities.
Well, Montgomery's one of the big cities, but the industries there, I hate to say, aren't conducive to the kind of educated South Asians, the doctors and the engineers. In Birmingham, it's a lot of the medical community because of the university there. In Huntsville, the defense industry, a lot of engineers, much bigger Indian American community. In fact, some of my parents' best friends are there. But yeah, that's how we ended up there. And, mom and dad are still there. Prior to the pandemic, I make it a point to go back every couple of years. My sister's in Florida. I have this weird relationship with the South, is what I'd say. I'm proud to be from there, but at the same time, I'm not going to live there.
Well, yeah, that's the thing, right? Let's take it back a second, too, because so growing up, I'm assuming you're a child of the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
Just like me. And as you said, there weren't a lot of Indian families where you were growing up. What was it like being an Indian kid in Montgomery, Alabama in the 80s?
Yeah, you guys have covered this theme on your show a lot, which is why I relate so hard to your show. It was like a secret identity, man. Mm. As South Asian in the South, an Asian in the South, is the name of the game is assimilation. You want to fit in, you don't want to stand out. The reason I don't speak much Hindi or Punjabi versus my older sister who can understand a little is because I think my parents saw my sister having trouble with English, and that's a no-no. You got to fit in. You've got to fit in when you go outside. My mom was the auntie who would wear Western clothes to temple because she was a teacher. When you come to our house on the weekend, the smells of the Indian cooking for the week, the bhajans, the Indian religious songs were playing on like full blast on the stereo, but not outside of our house. It was like, and so I kind of wore two identities. We both are comic book geeks, so my gravitation to that world might have come from that. I didn't have real Indian friends. There's a half Indian guy who I'm still very close with. We became friends when we were 8. Another kid moved in to town from the north when we were 13, and the three of us did hang together quite a bit. And I regret to say, all three of us had a little bit of shame hanging together because we got bucketed together. So much so that we probably did some mean things to each other, even though we were, to this day, very, very close. And what's interesting is there was a handful of other Asian kids, a couple of Thai guys, there's a couple of Taiwanese guys, etc., and girls, that we would kind of hang out with because we were all kind of the Asians, but we didn't want to all sit at the lunch table together. But if we all happened to be in the same math class or the same German class, we would hang together. But we were all trying to assimilate and have white friends and black friends. And it was really tricky.
That's always the case of being Asian American, right? Like that whole liminal space between Asian and American. You know, in particular, like you mentioned that there weren't others, you know, because a lot of folks, at least who have their Asian American stories presented in the mainstream media, like most of those stories come from like Asian enclaves, right? Like what it's like going to, you know, dim sum on weekends or the boba shop or going to, you know, Chinese school, like all the stuff that was all fresh off the boat, basically. No shade to Jeff Yang. But like for those of us who grew up in spaces where there weren't a lot, I mean, the parts of Fresh Off the Boat I identified with was like when Eddie's hanging out with like all his non-Asian friends, right? Because there weren't any other Asian kids around.
And, you know, really quick to jump in, the most authentic story of the Indian American experience is Never Have I Ever.
Yeah.
Because the main character, it's not about the Indianness. There's the occasional, I have to go to puja and I'm dressed up and I'm literally walking into my school gymnasium and no one's ever seen me dressed this way.
Right.
It's this hidden identity.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, like, you know, you mentioned, you know, my comics background. Part of the inspiration for Secret Identities, the book that I did with Jeff and Perry Shen and Jerry Ma, was this notion of like being Asian American, in particular, like a Superman character. I know that like he comes from like
the original immigrant,
but he was the original immigrant. And not only that, like Gene Yang's talked about this when he wrote Superman. Like he has the hyphenated name of his heritage that no one really knows how to pronounce correctly, but he has to use this assimilated name when he's
Clark and Cal. And what's interesting, I've thought a lot about this. East Asians versus South Asians, and I am going to draw a very broad stereotype. It's okay. Some of my best friends are Asian. But let's just use Chinese and Indians specifically. It's so interesting that Chinese people have, a lot of Chinese people, I should say, have a Western name and a Chinese name.
Yeah.
My wife is Chinese American, so she has that. When I did a lot of work with China in a past professional career, you know, I'd meet someone, they'd be like, oh, my name's Wendy Zhang. And I'm like, what's your real name? And they'd say it. I was like, okay, Wendy, got it. And whereas Indians, on the other hand,
you keep your names.
We keep our names. Now, why is that? And I'm not an authority on this, but I thought a lot about this. I think it's because we were colonized, more so. And so we all speak English. Or you go to India, you can get by on English, believe it or not. Like, it's just a thing, especially in the north. And I think as a result, that probably drives we'll just keep our name. It's fine. We speak English, learn to pronounce Javinder. You know, it's fine. Call me Joe if you need to. But my name on paper is going to be Devinder. Call me Dave, etc.
You know, I wonder, too, like, why that is, particularly with, like, Chinese folks. And less so now, right? Like, I think Chinese of a certain generation, because I think, like, newer generation Chinese immigrants keep their names, like Vietnamese.
Well, the ones coming over now. That's what I'm
saying. Like, more recent immigrants keep their name. But, like, I think there was that more of a pressure or, you know, desire for like the older generations when they were immigrating or coming over to like adopt a Western name. My family comes from Hong Kong, which is similarly colonized. And I think that was, you know, unlike what you were experiencing, like, I think the idea of like having the Chinese name plus the Western name on top. And I don't know if this is something that like my family did or it was, I think it's somewhat typical of like at least Hong Kong Chinese, is that the English name that you choose is very similar to your Chinese name. And my English name was supposed to be Norman, which sounds closer to my Chinese name Lokman. But then one of my mom's friends when she was pregnant was like, don't call him Norman. I have a friend named Keith. Why don't you name him Keith? So that became my name. But yeah, that's an observation I've never really paid a lot of attention to. That I think, and as we gain consciousness, right, like in college and stuff, and I started meeting other Asian kids who kept their like Asian names or never had like a Western name, you know, it made me kind of like It was my Malcolm X moment. I'm like, call me Lockman. Like, call me Locke. Locke was my name for like, at least in college, for around some certain people.
I had a friend whose girlfriend did that. Like, she had a Western name that everyone knew her as, but then when she moved towns, she decided to adopt her Chinese name and hold on to it. It's, the other thing that's interesting is, and I can say this more definitively for Southeast Asian cultures now, specifically India, the Philippines, and a few others, right? And I lived in Southeast Asia briefly, but it's this idea of the pet name in the family. So you have your name, your God-given name, and then you have the name that you're called around the household. And I actually just read in China, they did that as well. So spirits and demons wouldn't know who you really were when your family called you that all the time. And maybe because of that, there's a really fantastic book that most Indian men of our age have read called The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri. Yeah. And I mean, it's this definitive, this guy has a pet name and he has a real name, but he doesn't want one and he wants the other. Just call me Nick, all of this stuff. And it's a weird heritage play. Like, I don't know if you have kids, but I have 2 kids and my wife is Chinese American. I'm Indian American. And so it was important. How do we thread that needle? And we weren't everyone in the grandparents were going to be unhappy with, but our kids have Western first names, Chinese middle names, and the Indian last name.
Right.
And do I feel a little bit of regret for that? Sure. But if my kid had an Indian first name, that's kind of robbing of the Chinese heritage, or vice versa. And our kid is American first, right? It's kind of like RoboCop, half robot, half man, all cop, like half Indian, half Chinese, all American.
My daughter's in the same situation. My wife is Japanese, I'm Chinese. And
wow.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that's the thing that I think makes us Asian American, because there is this argument.
You can get past all the historical.
Exactly, because there is this argument. There is an argument that's out there in the ether right now because of a certain book by a certain writer for the New York Times. We won't say his name. Also, a Southern Asian. Jay, if you're listening, come on the podcast. I want to debate you.
Wait, no, hang on. Say it for all of us that are ignorant, like
Jay
me.
Caspian Kang.
Okay,
he's an opinion writer for the New York Times.
Okay,
and he wrote a book called The Loneliest Americans, and his main premise is
Asian podcasters.
Yeah, well, I don't necessarily want to call him out, but like his main argument is that Asian American is a myth. Like, there's no such thing as Asian American, right? And the main reason is like we have nothing in common. What do I, a Chinese American from rural Virginia, have in common with you, an Indian American from rural Alabama, or not rural Alabama, but like from Montgomery, Alabama? Like, we have nothing in common because you're Indian and I'm Chinese. But the thing is, I have more in common with you as an Asian American than I do with someone who's coming from China tomorrow.
Well, and that's the interesting thing, because that's actually why my wife and I got along, right? It's I was never very much a pro-Asian person, and I get into trouble having this conversation. Like, our podcast...
Do the potluck people know this?
No, they do.
I'm just playing.
I hope they do. Sorry, Marvin. Sorry, Phil. I became more Asian with my Chinese American wife, not because we're like so steeped in our own heritage. Like, if you go listen to one of my podcasts, like, we do a Diwali and a Chinese New Year episode, and the premise is my co-host Sharon and I, we don't know what the F, and she was Chinese American, we don't know what the F we're talking about. We're raising biracial kids. We're trying to connect to our heritage. But the thing that my wife and I connect more to, I told you my parents' kind of refugee, kind of political migration story. My wife's parents have the exact same thing. Her dad was in mainland China when the communists came to power and fled to Hong Kong. Her mom, Chinese, was born in Jamaica. When it got dangerous for Chinese people, they fled to Canada. Like, and so this kind of weird fit in, not fit in thing, that's what my wife and I have in common. I think at a more macro level, I do think that is what Asian Americans have in common. But like, I really do push back. We've made all the Asian American lists, or not as many as you guys have, but like, we make those because we have 2 Asian faces on our podcast, but we are like proudly an American podcast about minority perspectives. Like, and I sometimes get worried when I'm like working with Sharon, my co-host. I'm like, oh man, we're talking to like way too many Asians. Like, let's talk to Black people. Let's talk to queer people. Let's talk to Muslims. Let's talk to like, I want my.
I feel that honestly, like, maybe not Southern Fried Asian, because this podcast is specifically about the Asian American experience. But like, more broadly, the Nerds of Color, which is this podcast is a part of, I definitely have the same issue. It's like, kind of, I don't want to say problematic, but I think it's to me, it's concerning that the guy who came up with the Nerds of Color as a concept or as a website, being Asian American, knowing that like Asian Americans do have a level of privilege when it comes to like, I mean, that's why they had to create the BIPOC acronym, right? So like, I do think sometimes with the Nerds of Color, like, maybe we don't need to cover this Asian thing because it's going to get covered, right? Like,
here's what's interesting
on like Black stories or Indigenous stories or Latinx stories.
And here's what's so interesting. So my other podcast, Quarantine Comics, where my co-host is Chinese American Ryan, where it's literally a comic book club. And at first it started out as, let's just read the greats, the stuff we love, and we recommend stuff to each other. Like, he had never read Kingdom Come, but it was one of my favorites by Mark Waid and Alex Ross. And as we started spreadsheeting it out, I started noticing, oh, wow, it's a bunch of Americans. God knows how much Grant Morrison and Alan Moore we've read. And they are some of the greats. Right. But Mariko Tamaki and Jean Lun Yang and Junji Ito are also great. Okay, so that's cool. But literally, we find ourselves, oh my God, we have an American, British, Asian bias to comics. And we're literally trying to create that forcing function on ourselves to read more queer, Latinx, Black created comic, but it's hard because our instinct is like, oh man, I just want to read like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles by Eastman Laird. I want to read Savage Dragon. I want to read another Jean Lun Yang comic book. And our own biases come into the equation, I guess is the point.
Well, and then it didn't help that for generation, right? Like there were like Frank Miller and Alan Moore and Mark Waid, those guys dominated comics, right? Like you had to dig to find the Dwayne McDuffie comics or the Dennis Cowan comics. So like, or the Christopher Priest comics. Like, I mean, there are great Black comic stories out there, but they were not as celebrated as the greats the way that Frank Miller, Alan Moore.
Well, and it's not that those guys. I mean, I actually don't want to speak for all those guys because Warren Ellis, like but they're part of a system. And I think this is something I've learned so much. I've always known this, but intrinsically through the free therapy conversations of my podcast, systemic bias is a thing, be it in climate change, race, civil rights. Like, we need to have this groundswell from the ground up. But as there's an author that you should actually have on this show, Anjali Enjeti, who is based in Georgia. She's a political activist and an author. And she's like, look, as an artist, it's great for me to write and to do representation and all that stuff. But it's actually more valuable for me to go get more people registered to vote, to drive systemic change. We had a climate activist, Molly Kawahara, who's Japanese American, and she's like, it's all great that you want to green your life. Go compost, blah, blah, blah. But that's literally the man saying it's on you. No, it's actually on you to go register someone and to push for legislation to change these things. Right. Like, if we don't change the systems, all the like individual action, all the podcasts that we launch aren't going to do shit.
That's true. But I also think that it's a both and, especially when it comes to like the limits of representation in pop culture, particularly. Like, and that's something that like, Asians get pilloried for a lot too, is that our main focus, which I kind of agree with sometimes, like our main focus is like, how many Crazy Rich Asians can we get and less how many people can we register? And I do think, but at the same time,
I want to throw some shade at Crazy Rich Asians. I don't think that movie helped with our stereotypes. I think the better movie of that year was Always Be My Maybe.
Right. Well, but it was the cultural phenomenon, right?
But one was like, in all seriousness, like one was this like grandiose stereotype kind of Black Panther kind of movie, right? Crazy Rich Asians, of like, look at all this stuff, right. Versus this other one was. And you talked about this, like, about Riz Ahmed, right? Like, but like, whereas Always Be My Maybe, it's just about two people in love that happen to be Asian, and their journey of, and like the more realistic, the more realistic, grounded story. That's a both versus it's all Wakanda all the time. And I'm not saying you can't have that.
But at the same time, like, and my pushback on your pushback as a Crazy Rich defender, because like there's fewer and fewer of us as time it goes on, is that I look at Crazy Rich as like a sci-fi movie, right? It was a fantasy. It was a film like of that scope has never shown Asian people who spoke English, right? Mm-hmm. Like that was never that kind of movie. And that's but either way, like my point though is that like that there's a limit to that if that's like, okay, we've made it, we have our big fantasy blockbuster movie, our work is done, that's bullshit, right? But the power of representation is that Crazy Rich Asians open the door for more Asian American stories. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing, is that we need more diverse Asian American stories, the more there are, and not just Asian American stories for people of color, because those stories then fuel the narratives that help people get registered to vote. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's fair. Culture is a mover. And to be clear, we wouldn't have had Shang-Chi if we didn't have Black Panther.
Right.
And to be clear, you needed, and I've read a lot of Bob Iger interviews and stuff, he had to push really hard because it was the Henry Ford thing. You know, if we gave the customer what they wanted, they just get a faster horse. So it's this idea of like, we do have to move the ball. And here's what's interesting. When I've really started thinking a lot about representation. Okay, for little Asian kids like us growing up in the South, it was to see someone that looked like you on the screen super important. Okay, I think we're past that moment. My kids,
they're used to it.
She's got Mirror Royal Detective. Where representation matters more now. Like, so much more now. And this is, like, this, I'll bring it back to, like, my own Southern guilt. But it is important that my daughter goes and does a Chinese New Year program for Chinese New Year's at her school, where I think there's, like, one black kid, one Hispanic kid, and it's a bunch of other white kids. And so all of the non-Asian people understand that there is a thing. Like, representation matters. And this is where Crazy Rich Asians and Black Panther wins. Appeal to mainstream audiences with something never seen. I need the white person to see the Asian story. I need the Asian person to see the black story.
And that's the thing. I mean, and no shade to Always Be My Maybe, but like, we've had those movies for a long time. Yeah. Like, you mentioned The Namesake, like the Kal Penn movie from like 10 years ago, right? They've been there, but they've been there for like these small niche audience who went to see, you know, Better Luck Tomorrow, who went to see The Namesake. It was like the Asian audiences.
Well, yeah, those are for us. Those are for us.
Those are for us, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But Crazy Rich was for everyone.
And when Crazy Rich does well, and Netflix buys the rights to it, and they show the Asian people, they'll show the other stuff in the algorithm. So I think you still, like, and because I do think you need Sound of Metal. Like, I do think...
Yeah, absolutely.
So representation matters on a lot of fronts. And I guess there's a place for both. I think this is where you're right.
Yeah, that was my point. And my thing is always both and. Like, I always hate the choice, the dichotomy. It's like either you push for representation or you're pushing for, you know, political progress. And I feel like they're all of the same piece. Because as a guy who's like makes his, you know, bones in nerd culture, we get this a lot. Like, you know, what does it matter if you see more black superheroes if black kids are still getting shot by the police? Right. But, you know, if you really break it down, like, why are police shooting black people other than the fact that they're all fucking racist pigs? That's one. But the reason that there are so many racist fucking pigs is that they've been fed a story for years.
Well, so the running joke on Modern Minorities is, it's not a running joke. Like, if I had to shortcut why we do that show, we're here to solve racism.
Like, good job.
To be clear, we're failing.
You're doing such a good job.
Yeah, we're done. No, but my fundamental thesis, and this actually comes back to a little bit of my own Southern guilt, right? Like, put my money where my mouth is. But greater empathy and understanding.
Yeah.
If that cop had a black friend, I'm not saying it's not, some of my best friends are black. But no, if you literally understood and had greater empathy and understanding for other people's... So Modern Minorities, we designed the show. Our target audience isn't Asians.
Right.
You know, I'm sorry. I don't say, sorry, Potluck, sorry, buddy. Yeah. Like, I don't care if Asians listen to my show, unless they're listening to the episode with a black person or a queer person. We're designing our show for Karen. Our show, our design target, we're marketers by trade. Like, and the people who write us are those people.
Yeah.
I need... it's designed for your majority ears because we all have... You and I are both men. We're both straight men. Even though Muslim is becoming a majority, but not in America. Like, we are non-Muslims in this country. Those are things that we really need to internalize, just like a white guy needs to internalize the black experience, the Asian experience, etc.
100%. And, you know, just going back to that cop, he didn't even need to have a black friend. But, you know, I think about what the cop who shot Mike Brown said. Like... You know, the reason I had to shoot him, even though he had his hands up, he's like, he was coming at me. He was like this monstrous figure coming at me. And it was like, was it in reality or was it in your head? Because, like, and what is in your head has been conditioned to be there for generations, right? Like the notion of the, you know, monstrous subhuman black man,
or the suspicion of the brown guy that must be a terrorist.
Exactly.
Or when you hear Arabic. When you hear Arabic, does hair on the back of your neck tingle?
It's shorthand for like, here a bombing's about to happen.
Or
like,
do you hear, wow, that's a really beautiful sounding language?
Just go back to January 6th. I mean, it's tropey by this point, but like had 20. What the commission just said was like 2,500 people were in the Capitol on January 6th. Imagine if that was 2,500 Arab people.
Well, let me flip that. So I want to flip it on myself. And I have to come back to my own Southern bias for your show. But like, here's my bias, dude. When I swear this is true. And I'm sorry, America. When I see someone in a red hat, I get a little scared. When I see a truck drive by with an American flag on a stick waving behind it, like, I actually do get scared because I have had encounters with racism, like in assault. And, like, those things scare me. But not all people wearing red hats. And I'm not specifically just generic red hats.
No, trust me. I'm a Chicago Bulls fan. And trust me, I was looking for like a hat over the summer, and like half the Bulls hats are red, and I'm like, fuck, I can't buy a red Bulls hat.
Right, and that sucks. Like that totally sucks. That I have been conditioned to that. I'll tell you a funny story, and then I will get to Southern Guilt. Like, I love the Fantastic Four. I have a Fantastic Four t-shirt. It's one of my favorite nerd shirts. I would like wear it to like industry conferences when I was like a corporate guy, because I'd wear it over a blazer, because invariably it was like secret code. It wasn't the Superman shirt. It wasn't a Batman shirt. It was a 4. Well, what's the 4 for? I don't know. Is that your company logo? But the other nerd across the room would be like, and literally I met one of my favorite black nerd friends, Keith. Like, he was like, Johnny Storm! And that was the foundation of our friendship. I wore that t-shirt to China.
I was going to say,
my in-laws.
you can't.
My in-laws were not happy with their son-in-law.
When you married into a Chinese family, you can no longer like the Fantastic Four. You have to get 4 more of them and be the Fantastic 8.
No,
otherwise...
okay. Southern Guilt. I have to come back to this.
Yeah.
I knew from an early age I wanted to leave the South. It just had some bad experiences. I won't get into them on this show. Like, listen to my other show.
Of all the shows to get into them, though.
It's the slow burn of therapy on my other podcast. It comes up with every guest. But I knew I had to leave. And you know what's funny? My cadre of like academically performing people, again, boy, girl, white, brown, black, whatever, all of us knew like, it's the South, better opportunity outside. And so people were going to New York, DC, overseas, California. Right. We're all popping off and kind of leaving the Southeast, escaping what we call the Bermuda Triangle of Atlanta, Nashville, Birmingham, kind of where if you're smart, you go to those probably. Mm-hmm. And so we all left. A lot of us did. Like 80% of us left. And, a lot of us reconvened over the years. Like, I'd meet up with friends in DC, I'd meet up with friends in Dubai, I'd meet up with friends in San Francisco. Then 10 to 20 years pass and we all start having kids. The white, straight ones are all moving back into the Golden Triangle. Because, as you get older, you want to be close to your parents, your family, your support network. You want your kids to know their grandparents. Those of us that are BIPOC or queer, we're not going back. Mm-hmm. And I struggle with that because I understand why I'm not going back. I don't want my kids to experience some of the things. And even though Alabama is different than it was, it's still kind of like I see it more. I see it more now for what it is when I go home. Back then I was a fish living in water and I didn't know I was in water. And now I go back and I see things like, Mom, Dad, that just happened. Really? Or I pay attention to the headlines on AL.com and stuff like that. But if I were to go back, I would be part of the solution. I would be normalizing. My vote matters more in Alabama than it does up here. I was going to say,
I mean, this is something that I talk about a lot on this podcast too, is that there is, and for good reason, right? Like there is a sense that we should just abandon the South, for the trauma it's inflicted on not just us, but like people of color writ large. Mm-hmm. But at the same time,
it'll never change if we don't.
It won't change. So we just fuck it. Let the politicians who run that part of the country just keep power. But to your point, if more of us reclaim the South, that's a loaded concept. But if those who look like us and of darker shades were to go back, and not even to go back, there are huge populations of black people who are still in the South,
and Asians,
right? That's the whole this show, right? And like the leaving of the South, or even not even leaving it physically, but leaving it emotionally and mentally. What does it say to the folks who are still there?
That's
right?
I've left it physically. To be clear, I've told my parents we're not moving down there during the pandemic. I'm like, literally, this is where politics like gets a little scary. Like perceptions on the pandemic and safety. I have an older sister. She is a physician and she lives in Florida and she has she's married to a black man. My nephew and niece are half black, or they're black passing, to be clear. And we are of similar like kind of progressive ideals. And she's a physician, to be clear. Mm-hmm. But she's living in the sentiment of the pandemic in the South. She doesn't necessarily even agree with some of the craziness that's going on. But literally her family's practices and what they're doing in the pandemic are informed by the culture of Florida versus kind of the culture of the Northeast. Like, we're a little more paranoid and scared here. Maybe it's because we got hit really hard at the beginning. But it's so interesting how an environment can change you when you live in it.
Yeah.
And I didn't know some of the racism I was experiencing, the passive racism, never mind the overt racism, but when I was living in it. And is it made me a better person now that I sit on the outside of it and I can look at it and I can study it and talk about it and therapy myself on shows like this and my own? Like, I don't know.
But it also kind of like assumes, and I'm not saying this is your reasoning, but it also assumes that like places like New York don't have racism, right? Like it's just a problem of Alabama or Georgia or Tennessee. You know what I'm saying? Like, but when you look at like all of the quote unquote Asian hate over the last 2 years, where's all that shit happening? San Francisco, New York.
Well, that's right? It's a numbers thing.
Well, that's a numbers thing, but racism is not the sole domain of the South
absolutely.
either.
The thing I would say the South has is we wear the racism. It's in the air. It's on our sleeve down there, and we have different ways of confronting it. It's a little bit more under the surface up here and in these areas. But David 100%. Cross, the comedian, has a really great bit from his double album back in the early 2000s, where he's talking about the redneck accent, right? And he's like, that thing exists everywhere. It's like, I'm from Bozeman, Montana. I'm from Albany, New York. Like, to be clear, it's an urban rural thing. However, in the states where the urban population is super magnified, pockets like Atlanta, this is why Georgia will flip because of Atlanta, to be clear. Obviously, New York City, San Francisco, Austin, Dallas. When you have high population bases in those states, that's enough to tilt the favor of the state to, and I hate to say blue progressive policies, but that you look at an electoral map based on populations because of these population centers. As Birmingham, and this is where gerrymandering, I think the Supreme Court just struck some stuff down with Alabama and gerrymandering, but they've literally drawn the district. There's like one black congressional district in Alabama, 6 congressional districts, because they've drawn the lines around it, even though the black population is so pervasive. So that's how you even get around this population shift. And so coming back to, it's a yes and, this is where systemic change, like, we have to solve these problems. Otherwise, the soon-to-be minority will be kind of pushing down on our now black and brown majority.
That's why I think it's so important to lead these fights in states like Alabama, Georgia,
yes,
Mississippi, because there is a sentiment, I think, in a lot of Democratic, I'm not necessarily a fan of the Democrats just because of like how they just like to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. But part of that is because, one of the things that I admire about the Obama strategy, and even, Stacey
it was a 50 state strategy.
50 state. Like, we got to go everywhere. We can't just bank votes in California and New York and just think we got, win the popular vote and move on. Like, we got to compete in Alabama. Like, the fact that we competed in Georgia, to your point, that Georgia flipped. Maybe part of this is my optimism at being a Virginian at heart, even though I don't live in Virginia. I only moved north of Virginia.
How'd that governor's election go for you, buddy?
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, Terry McAuliffe was a fucking terrible candidate.
The black woman who was primarying him, man.
If she was our candidate,
she would have ignited the party. Like,
yeah, exactly. And when that's the thing, like, we like to play it safe, right? We like to
even Obama, like,
even Obama, but like,
during the primaries, people were like, we don't want that guy.
Right.
For whatever reason, but because he wasn't the safe bet.
Exactly. But he energized the party.
Exactly.
And not just the party, he energized the country, he energized people. And say what you want about his, like, actual policies once he became president, but like, you remember 2008. I remember, like, there was a sense of hope, to coin a phrase.
Two things happened. Like, you had people in the middle, even right-leaning people in the middle. And again, Trump pulled those guys too. But you also had political sideliners, myself, and a number of other people, like, who all of a sudden became activated and dropped what they were doing. My then girlfriend, now wife, she had already moved to New York. So we were doing distance, and I had a lot more free time. So I started knocking on doors in Hamilton County, Ohio. And here's what's interesting, coming back to activation, something I learned from someone you've got to have on your show, Anjali Enjeti, this author and political activist in Georgia. The Southeast has the second largest concentration of Asians versus the West Coast.
Yeah.
So it's this, I don't want to say it's a silent majority, but like, it's an active population. And
I mean, activate the Asian American vote in Georgia and you win. That's what happened, right? That's what happened in 2020. You activate the Asian American vote. And part of the mission statement of this podcast is to, like, show the world, right? To your point, who is the audience? The audience is everyone who didn't know that there were Asians in the South, basically, right? The fact that you said, the fact that you're from Alabama used to just be like a little party trick.
My fun fact, yeah.
Your one fun fact. But, like, this is the mission statement of this podcast is like, hey, we're here and we're all over. We're everywhere. Like, one thing I've learned doing this podcast, so many, like, prominent Asian Americans in media and tech and business have roots in the South, like, and that's something that, as you probably felt growing up alone. I felt growing up alone. We must be the only ones. Like, I joke oftentimes, if you go to Wikipedia and look up Luray, Virginia, where I'm from, which it was a town no one's heard of.
The population's gone down.
yeah, exactly. It's a town no one's heard of until recently, when the lady threatened to shoot up a school if they had to wear masks. Now my hometown's all over the news. But until then, no one knew where Luray, Virginia was. But if you go to the Wikipedia page and look up, like, demographics of the 1980s, it says, like, Asian 0.01%.
That was your family.
That's my whole family. That's my whole family. But anyway, before we let you go, we end every episode on a food memory that you have from Alabama, because both being Asian and being Southern, if there's one thing that ties both of those identities together, is food. Is there a dish that no matter where you are in the world, whether you're in Dubai or in New York or San Francisco, will always bring you back to Montgomery, Alabama?
This is a tricky one. I mean, here's one thing. I admire, I think so many of our Asian podcasts, like we have a question about mom dish at the end of our show.
Asians love food.
We love our food.
And then when you're Southern on top of it, it just...
I mean, food is love. Food is culture, you know? So yes, but I want to kind of leave it. So my mom's chana bhatura. Bhatura is a fried flatbread with spices. Chana is spicy chickpeas. And it's my mom's favorite dish. It's honestly, even she doesn't make it as much because it's a production to make it. You will smell up your house when you make it. So more often than not, she comes up and she makes chicken curry for me or something. And you can get that at the restaurant. Very rarely can you get good chana bhatura at a restaurant. Sometimes I actually have to go to South Indian restaurants because they have the big fryers that they make the dosa in. But a very specific memory that, like, the power of this dish. One, it's fried, so Southern.
Yeah, there you go.
My late uncle, he passed away from cancer years ago, but at the beginning of his cancer, he was living in California, but there was a cancer specialist in New Orleans. And this is my mom's younger brother, my pretty much godfather growing up. Uncle Joe, short for Jawar Nehru, Uncle Joe. So Uncle Joe was really scared about this surgery. And so his big sister, my mom, at the time, my grandparents from England were with my mom. They all drove down from Alabama to New Orleans. I flew down from Cincinnati, where I was living, for the surgery. And his kids were there and everything. And, you know, Joe was scared. He thought it might be his last meal, you know, before he had to start fasting for the surgery. And he asked my mom if she would make her chana bhatura, because my mom makes ace chana bhatura, just like my grandma does. And they were staying at, you know, one of those extended stay suite things. Everyone, we were all staying at theirs. Yeah. And my mom brings, like, the hot plate, the big wok to fry the things in. Smells up the hotel. Smells up the entire hotel. It was such, like, that smell to this day. When I walk into, like, Sarana Bhavan, a place in Murray Hill, an Indian place, like that South Indian place that makes it, but when I smell chana bhatura, whether I'm in Singapore, New York City, an auntie's house, like, I'm taken back not just to growing up eating it on the weekends, but, like, that memory. It's like, it's such a beautiful dish, and it's going to smell up your damn house, and it's so worth it. So, yeah, my mom's chana bhatura.
I mean, the best dishes take over the whole home. Like, that's what they do. It doesn't smell it up, it just takes it over.
It's an unwelcome house guest for the next 2 weeks.
You just have to plan it and time it just right.
Yeah.
Well, Raman, I wish we had more time. I would love to talk to you more. Maybe I can come on your podcast. Here's me pitching.
I've got 2 or 3 of them, so yeah, man.
Speaking of that podcast, how can people who are listening to this one find that and you online?
Yeah, I tend to be a little bit of a ghost on the internet's ironic given the podcast. So if you want to check out Modern Minorities, where we're solving racism every week, modmypod.com. If you want to geek out with my comic book club, Quarantine Comics, QTDcomics.com. And if you want to hear a pretty interesting business podcast, check out pgalums.com/podcast.
Awesome. Raman, thank you again for being on this show and just having such a great conversation. We will definitely check your many shows out in the future, and I hope you'll come back.
Absolutely, and I hope it's the first of many conversations, my friend.
You can follow me on Twitter at @TheRealChow, _real_Chow, and on Instagram at RealKeithChow. Follow the podcast at Southern Fried Asians on Instagram and at Southern Asians on Twitter. Subscribe and download on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, anywhere you get podcasts. Find it all at hardknockmedia.com/Southern Fried Asian. As always, the podcast has been co-produced by Jess Vu. And until next time, keep it Southern Fried, y'all.